Welcome everyone. First things first, we apologize for the disgusting display. We were hacked with that previous link, and we deleted that link, sent out a new link. If it happens again, we will end this meeting promptly and we will reschedule for another day. Hopefully it will not happen again. We apologize for that. But thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Economic Impact Town Hall related to COVID-19. We have a tremendous panel for you, and I'm going to hit 4 different items that came from the governor's meeting this morning of the Economic Response Task Force, and then we'll turn it over to the panel for the rest of the hour. We're starting at 3:20, so we'll plan to go until 4:20 for the full hour. And again, apologize for the disruption and the hack from before, and if it happens again, we will immediately end this meeting. So with that being said, I am using I'm using a Word document here that I'm reading from. So Nick, who is our administrator, will be watching for any potential hacks. So there were 4 key takeaways from the governor's Economic Response Task Force meeting this morning that we wanted to share with you immediately. First, as expected, we are likely to move from red to orange, and the governor emphasized that he plans to act incrementally in conjunction with the Legislative Commission. The League, the Association of Counties, and other stakeholders are still providing input on 2.0. The commission is actually meeting this afternoon on some additional feedback that the governor requested. When I say we, Brandy, Grace, and I both asked this morning for clarification around the regional aspects to 2.0. The governor told us that he will give guidance about the colors. If we are in the high state of urgency, is the color red, or orange, or yellow, or green, green being recovery, orange and yellow being different phases of stabilization. He will give guidance, expect people to use their common sense and follow the recommendations, but he does still want to empower local elected officials and local health departments to have a key collaborative role in those decisions, because data-driven differences could exist as needed by region. We'll have more info about that process in our call with the Lieutenant Governor tomorrow. He emphasized that social distancing during the orange phase will still be critical, and we talked briefly about restrictions on mass gatherings. At this point, he's thinking that the mass gathering threshold would be 10 or more as we pivot to orange, and large mass gatherings will be the last to resume. We've received a lot of phone calls, as has the Association of Counties, about mass gatherings like 4th of July parades, and other summer festivals. The League, in conjunction with the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce, Association of Counties, and many other stakeholders, are actively working now on recommendations around those types of gatherings. My colleague Katie Harley is spearheading that group, so if you have any questions or want to participate in that group, please let us know. There was also significant discussion about childcare needs, because schools will still be closed in May as employees are transitioning back to work, and there's a working group that is involved on that front, and the League is also participating there. So if you have any questions on either of those fronts, let us know. The second key takeaway is around PPE, personal protective equipment, and sanitation supplies, because businesses as well as local governments are going to need sufficient PPE in order to move to that orange phase. The League and UAC will be hosting a town hall on Friday where we will have updates on this, as well as updates throughout the week. There was a survey that the League participated in that EDC Utah conducted, and they had over 250 respondents, of which 43% expressed concern about their existing vendors or supply chains around PPE and sanitation supplies. So both President Adams and Governor Herbert on the call this morning recognized this was a top priority, and there was discussion about potentially using some of the federal stimulus money around purchasing this PPE on behalf of businesses and residents. The third key takeaway is that we had over 6,000 tests in recent days from 56 testing sites, and work continues to expand testing so that people will feel comfortable and safe returning to work during the orange phase. And then the fourth major takeaway was around housing, and a discussion about the housing market and what May and June may mean for our residents because of unemployment, the timing of state unemployment insurance, the timing of federal CARES Act dollars, and the particular impact on our neighbors who are rent burdened. As a reminder, the governor's executive order expires on May 15th. He does have a subgroup that is focused on housing. I serve on that subgroup that's working on recommendations for the state to consider for landlords, tenants, and homeowners. And several of the individuals who serve on that housing subgroup are with us today. So with that, that's the high-level overview from the governor's Economic Response Task Force meeting this morning. I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, John Park, who has put together the panel for a deep dive on some of these very topics. John, take it away.
Thank you, Cameron. Very interesting information. We're very excited today. We have a great panel. I'm going to quickly introduce our first three participants as we discuss housing and other real estate in the state of Utah. First of all, we have from the Ken Gardner Policy Institute is James Wood. He specializes in several research areas such as housing, construction, real estate, and economic development. Has published over 100 articles and studies related to Utah economy. And as Cameron mentioned, each of these fine folks are a member of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. After Jim is done, we'll have Jonathan Hardy. John serves as the Director of Housing and Community Development within the Department of Workforce Services. And he's also served as the Area Director for Workforce Development in Salt Lake and Twilla County. And lastly, we have Lloyd Allen. Lloyd is with CBRE, and well, unfortunately for him, he spent the first 15 years of his career, I guess, as an attorney. But he's took that great work and turned it to he's now a realtor for commercial project. He runs the office here in town and has been doing that for over 15 years. And so we'll just turn the time over and we'll go first with James, who will give us kind of the overview, and then Jonathan will talk about the workforce services view of some of the housing issues we deal with. And then I think there's no one better than Lloyd to bring us up to speed of where commercial development is right now. So let's go, Mr. Wood. Jim, are you there?
I am. I'm spare.
Wait, you are.
Will you? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Jim.
Okay.
We can hear you, Jim. You're coming in just fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we met with the Revenue Assumption Working Group last Tuesday and came up with the revised forecast for revenues for the state. The consensus forecast goes to both the legislative and the executive branch. And the revised forecast, of course, is in response to COVID-19. And first of all, start with employment, which we show actually 2 months ago, we had pretty good growth for this year in forecasts, but this time after the revision, we show about a 6.2% decline in employment for the year. That would be down about 100,000 jobs. That's the sharpest single year decline in our history. In 2008, we had in the Great Recession, actually 2009, we had a drop of about 5.1%, which was 64,000 jobs. So this is a really sharp, sudden hit to the Utah economy and particularly jobs. And that will ripple, of course, through other sectors, through all the sectors of the Utah economy. The good news is that our forecast showed a very strong rebound in 2021. And that rebound with a growth of 8.3%, which would be a very strong 120,000 new jobs. So coming back, and basically by the end of 2021, we would be back to where we were in 2019. So we lose a year going down and a year coming back, but we would be just under 1.6 million. Unemployment, the forecast for this year, the unemployment over 8.6%. That would be the annual unemployment rate. We're going to have some months much higher than that in May, and we'll get some numbers, I guess, Friday or April, but we're going to see some double-digit months, I would expect. But on the rebound, we come down to 5% by 2021. So still a bit high. We have been running below 3%. So I'll let somebody else in on this now, John. But that's the employment and unemployment. We can talk about housing and some of those issues next round.
Jonathan, you want to go? Jonathan Hardy, are you there?
Yeah, Jonathan was with us on the first link. I'm looking for him now.
Let me see if I got an email from him. Lloyd, why don't you just go ahead?
You know, I'm happy to take a moment. Can I start with a quick sound check and make sure that you're able to hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Very good. Well, let me go ahead and share my screen and then I will give you a couple of thoughts and hopefully some good insight with respect to the overall commercial real estate market that we're dealing with. And there we go. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Again, a quick introduction. Lloyd Allen. I'm the Managing Director for CBRE and have the opportunity to handle the overall operations for CBRE here in the area. My objectives in the next few minutes is to give you just a bit of an overview of what we see happening globally, or excuse me, mostly nationally in the commercial real estate market, and then to take a moment and bring it down to a few things that are happening in the local market so that you get a sense for it. Consistent with what Jim was saying with respect to the overall commercial real estate market, we certainly expect it to have a proportionately type of impact with respect to the global recession that's expected for Q2 and possibly Q3. For commercial real estate, it is a lagging indicator in many ways, and expect that whatever recovery happens in the overall market, that commercial real estate will lag that recovery by at least 12 months, and in some sectors as much as 30 months. That would be picked up in some of the heavy tourist-based type of regions, or possibly because of what we're seeing in energy, in some of the energy-based type of regions. The federal stimulus, we expect to prevent a worst-case scenario, that will create a bit of a safety net and allow some good recovery. Critical to all that with respect to commercial real estate, and those of you who were a part of the 2008 and 2009 will recognize that the debt and the financing markets were critical to maintaining stability there. Just a quick couple of takes. CMBS lending, which many of you may cross paths with, is basically on the sidelines, has been for a number of weeks. Other type of lending mechanisms remain available, although I'll give you a couple of examples later in our discussion about some much more stringent underwriting and some wider spreads from what you're seeing of the overall lending market. I'd like to now take a look at each of the sectors, office, retail, industrial, and then a little bit on the capital markets. With respect to what I think you'll see over the next period of time with respect to the office market, it'll actually be a little bit insulated compared to some of the markets. We'll certainly see a slowing in leasing activity, a rise in vacancy, and a rise in subleasing space. I think those aren't concepts that would surprise you at all. What is going to be surprising and interesting in the office sector is whether this turns it completely into a tenant's market. We have, for a period of time, been in a position where owners, developers were in a strong position, but there's certainly a lot of talk in the industry about the COVID-19 effect making us a tenant-based market. A lot of tenants right now simply put transactions on hold, and that is to be expected. But what's not known is whether they're on hold because they believe that July, June, August, whatever, will bring them put them in a better position to deal with matters, or whether we'll simply see a long-term pullback from that market. In the office sector, it's also going to be very interesting to understand whether there's going to be a conceptual change, whether work remote is going to reduce the need for office space, or whether the idea of expanded space, more workspace 10 feet apart, will create an expansion. Those are a lot of the discussions, a lot of the questions that are going on in the market sector, and I think are yet to be answered. The retail sector, and I believe that certainly a lot of the towns and cities are very interested to know what's happening in the retail sector. Unquestionably the hardest hit, whether it's restaurant or other personal care, haircut type of facilities and the like, absolutely closed down. The expectation, as Jim mentioned, is that they'll be able to reopen and re-employ quickly. What you're seeing, well, a more resilient area is the grocery and pharmacy and all of the associated centers or tenants in those centers. Retail is going to be the most likely area to be seeking rent relief very quickly. In fact, I think you've already seen the headlines of national players such as Cheesecake simply saying that they won't pay April's rent, or Brio having already closed 71 stores. Those are fairly significant impacts. On the opposite side of that, you're seeing some stores like Michael's and Joann's, Hobby Lobby, where they've been deemed essential, being very active. On a local front, we are certainly mimicking what you're seeing nationally. A little bit of strength with respect to locally is that retail development over the last year or year and a half has been a bit stifled. And so there's not as much of a correction to happen in the retail development area. And a very bright line for retail is that we've seen quite a bit of absorption of what you would call the mid-sized box and being picked up by areas like Planet Fitness and Vasa Fitness, who hope to be reopening in a good period of time. Retail is going to be hard hit though overall. Let me talk a little bit about the industrial sector. If you talk to my local brokers who will go out along California Avenue or the Northwest Quadrant, they will tell you that the trucks are moving and that there's a very good level of activity in that sector. Nationally, we expect the industrial and the logistics and the distribution groups to certainly see a slowdown, a modest increase in vacancies. But in fact, we think that industrial and logistics will actually be a long-term beneficiary of the change. A stronger and a quicker move to e-commerce will drive a need for industrial development. A stronger move by retailers to control their inventory will also see a boost to some of the warehousing. Locally, we're in an interesting situation. We began this period with over 7 million square feet of warehouse under construction. I believe, and I'm going to check my numbers really quickly, in 2008, we ended 2018 with just 1.2 million under construction. Salt Lake has a lot of industrial construction going on right now, but it also has the benefits of being a crossroads, both highway, railroad, and the like. And so although we expect to see vacancy go up, we expect it to go from a 3.5% to about a 4%. That is still a very healthy market. In fact, for some of the e-commerce and some of the warehousing, this may give some opportunities to have a little bit of choice as opposed to being driven to single resolutions. We expect overall that the healthy industrial market, after it takes a bit of a pause, will benefit from some of the changes that we're seeing in the marketplace. Let me look for just a moment with you at the capital markets. Our capital markets, meaning the buying and selling of large properties, has slowed but not stalled. I'll give you an example. We have a very nice transaction that was closed to set for last week. It did not close, but it will set the end of, or close the end of this week. There's been some adjustment in pricing, some adjustment in underwriting, but some of those large solid transactions are still going forward. Let me give you another example. Another deal that's not going forward ended up being at a 59% loan to value ratio with a 3.9, I believe, percent rate. And the underwriter has come back and said that the requirements to lend now will be a 50% loan to value ratio, with the rate going from 3.9 to 5%. So we certainly expect that there'll be more aggressive underwriting, and sometimes those gaps make it very difficult for parties to close. That's kind of a sector by sector quick review for you.
Yeah, Lloyd, if I can ask a couple questions, what do you see as far as the rural versus urban area, or the kind of mom and pop store versus the kind of chains that you've already kind of covered?
You know, John, very good question. If they're essential type of services, grocery and pharmacy, I believe that'll even bode stronger for the rural type of markets. If there are more choice and preference, I think the stop in tourism, the stop in travel will make it much more difficult, and a bit of a longer return time. Because for those non-essential type of operations, you're going to not only have to have the market recover, but you're going to have consumer confidence and comfort in going to the hospitality sectors, the restaurant sectors. And I think you'll find that being a harder hit for some of the rural type of areas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go to John Hardy. Jonathan, would you just maybe start off discussing housing as it looks like from the Department of Workforce Services?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about what housing resources are out there. I think we have a little bit of unknowns in the marketplace. So I don't really have a good crystal ball for the very far future. But what we're dealing with right now, obviously we've got the executive order that's halting some evictions if it's related to COVID-19, people having a job loss. The purpose of that was to help people get, the consumer get connected to unemployment insurance. If they've been detached from the workforce related to COVID-19, we want to make sure people get connected to that safety net. That's the primary safety net that's helping consumers cover their bills in the short term. The way the enhanced benefits are structured under unemployment insurance until July 31st, most workers that were making $60,000 or less a year will be making replacement or better wages under the unemployment insurance program. So this is one instance where lower paid workers are going to be making more under our unemployment than they would be working. The nice thing about the unemployment program is even as industries get phased back in, if somebody is working 40 hours before, then they were furloughed and they come back at 20 hours, they're still eligible for unemployment insurance benefits, depending on how much they make. And they're still going to be qualified for, as long as they're qualified for $1, the state unemployment benefit, they'll also be eligible for the $600 a week federal benefit passed under the CARES Act. So we feel like a good majority of the population has got, especially the renting population, has got a safety net to cover expenses. There's a little bit of gap between when people apply And when they get qualified for their benefits, that's at 21 to 30 days right now is what's estimated by our unemployment insurance division. They're processing fast and furious, and we've gotten a lot of people connected to that. So we feel good about that. The eviction moratorium executive order expires May 15th. So we've really been trying to get people connected into those systems before we hit that May 15th deadline. Now, there's always populations that fall through the cracks somewhat. So we're trying to stand up some housing assistance programs in the short term to make sure we keep people safely housed where they're at. We don't want to have people having to double up with other families, or worst case scenario, have to go to the homeless shelter where, it's much more of a public health issue as well as a financial issue for that family. So we have $1 million approved by the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund to get us started. This is existing money that we had, and we got a waiver from HUD to use it this way. And that is going to go into effect in probably a week or two. We have $3.1 million from the CARES Act that is in our Emergency Solutions Grant program that will also be distributed. We don't have that money approved yet. We're working on that with HUD at this time. Now, we don't do any of the direct assistance, so we contract out with community action agencies and Association of Governments in rural areas to administer these types of programs. So we will be producing a list of those agencies and the amounts available and the criteria here in the next week or two, but there will be a designated agency for every area administering this assistance. We are encouraging other entities that may have funds that they're putting towards rental assistance. Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City both get emergency solutions grants money from HUD like us that could be utilized this way. CDBG, home, those are also options for those areas that want to implement something like this. And we're encouraging people to follow a lot of the same guidance that we're trying to work on as a community and work with the same agency so there's a one-stop shop for housing assistance in the short term. Now, after July 31, this is a little bit of an unknown. We don't know kind of where our economic activity is going to be July 31. Are people going to be fully back to work? What does it look like across the country? Unemployment insurance, enhanced benefits, and July 31st, do those get extended? So there's a lot of unknowns. We know the legislature's set aside $20 million to stand up a rental assistance program beginning August 1st. So we're taking our time to evaluate what the factors will look like come August 1st to stand that program up. But we're working hard to understand all these groups, factors. But the biggest thing is we want to make sure people get connected to the primary social safety net of unemployment insurance at this time. And then if you're ineligible for that, that means you're eligible for housing assistance. But almost everybody is eligible for unemployment insurance or the pandemic unemployment that's also been authorized under the CARES Act. So we hope we have good resources to take care of some groups that may not be covered, make sure people stay housed. And it's kind of a wait and see to see how this rolls out and what our needs will be August 1st. So those are the things that we're looking at from a housing perspective, and happy to answer any questions if you have them.
You mentioned that some people under 60,000 that makes under $60,000 annually would actually be making more money under unemployment than they would working. And how does it? That seems like a disincentive to really get the economy rolling again and people back to work.
Well, and this is so it is kind of a strange thing. Wasn't kind of a Utah thing. It's just the way the unemployment insurance is set up nationwide. It was easier to set up the $600 a week additional benefit. Most unemployment insurance programs are set up to have a 40 to 50% replacement wage, and then it gets capped out. But if you take that, I mean, if a lower wage worker is going to make 50% of their replacement wage plus $600 a week,
Plus
if they
another
qualify.
30,000. Yeah.
So that's why we've got, it's just the way it's set up, but it does help us also phase back in, especially a lot of these are from the hospitality industry. And if we come back at half capacity in our restaurants or however that looks like, people can still work and be qualified for those benefits until we can get them fully employed. I mean, it's really, those enhanced benefits are there to keep people stable until we can get back to full employment. It only goes through July 31st, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be other things stood up if there's a whole environment that we're still responding to.
Well, of course, the good side of that is the spending capability is still there, in which in itself should do as much to kind of jumpstart this economy as anything.
Yes. I see there's a question in the chat room. Gig employees, they are qualified under that pandemic unemployment. So if they're not eligible for traditional unemployment, they can apply for the pandemic unemployment. It also has that $600 a week additional benefit attached to that as well.
Okay, thank you, John. And Jim, do you want to add some housing component to what you talked about earlier?
Yes, I would. And I think Jonathan Shop has it targeted. The most vulnerable group really is the renter. In Utah, we have almost 300,000 renter households. Just to give you an idea of the difference in income, the median income for homeowners about $85,000 a year. Median income for a renter is about $44,000, so about half. And renters also have a higher share of workers in retail, accommodation, food services, in those sectors of the economy that are quite vulnerable and where we've seen a real spike in unemployment insurance applications. So that what I worry about on the renter side, and I understand that unemployment insurance is going to cover a lot of people and it's terrific coverage. But typically, now these numbers come from our Revenue Assumption Working Group last Tuesday. Mark Nold at the Department of Workforce Services gave a presentation showing that even at the peak of the Great Recession, only unemployment insurance claimants accounted for 45% of the unemployed count. So there are a lot more unemployed people than there are those claiming unemployment insurance. And so even if you took a scenario and assumed something like, okay, now the gig workers are covered and self-employed are covered. So you got more coverage now than we've had in the past. Let's go to 60%, say 60% of those claiming unemployment insurance, that would represent 60% of the unemployed. In that case, you would still have currently close to 100,000 individuals who are unemployed and are not part of the UI system. Now, some of those I would expect are undocumented. We have about 75,000 workers, 1 out of 20 in the Utah economy is an undocumented worker, and they cannot receive, they're not eligible for unemployment insurance. They do pay rent. They could have been laid off. Many of those undocumented workers are in retail, they're in accommodations, they're in food service. So they are at risk. It's currently, the CARES Act has some limited protection for renters. up to 120 days, as Lloyd showed. They could get, if the apartment project or a home, single family home they're renting, if it is backed by a mortgage from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, VA, USDA, FHA, then they would have 120 days of protection from eviction. But we don't have good numbers for Utah, but using the national ratio, which is about 28% of rental units have financed by the groups I just mentioned. So that leaves a lot that are not. Now, the protection also extends to HUD assisted. So you have vouchers, you have tax credit units, you have rural development 515 units. So those would also be protected. If you total those up, you have about 44% of rental units in Utah would have the CARES protection for eviction of 120 days. So that leaves a big chunk, over half, of 300,000 rental units where there is not the eviction protection. Now, the state, of course, has the executive order, which runs through mid-May, May 15th, I believe. But I would guess that a lot of those folks who I talked about that don't have unemployment insurance also don't have eviction protection. And that is a gap that I do worry about. They are quite vulnerable. They're in those industries where it's relatively low wage and they could have likely been laid off and they have no protection.
And of course, that's exacerbated.
Hello, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you, John.
His mic is apparently having problems. So Cameron, are you there?
Yep. So Jim and John and Lloyd, thank you for the information there about the real estate markets and the housing markets. Really the key timeframes for city leaders to know is that the state executive order expires May 15th. There are federal protections that go into the summer. Those are around the residential tenants. From a commercial perspective, Lloyd's information was fascinating to understand what's happening now, but also that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And as we look forward, there is good news to come if we can weather the current storm that we're facing for both commercial and residential tenants. So thank you to the three of you, Jim Wood, John Hardy, Lloyd. Any final comments from the three of you before we go to Roger and Juliet?
Cameron?
Yes.
Could I just make a couple of comments on the small business sector? I've done a little work on that, and there also the assumption in the PPP and the CARES Act is that we will begin a pretty good recovery by midsummer. But again, there's a vulnerable group. If you look at the small business sector in Utah, we have 57,000 small business enterprises with less than 20 employees. And that's the nail salon and the small restaurant and a lot of small retail. And many Utah firms, 21,000, did get the first round of the PPP. I got loans averaging about 176,000. Another 18,000 didn't get approved, and I'm sure they're in the queue today to try and get a loan. But there again, it's 2 months worth of payroll and some expenses is the idea of what this loan is going to cover. And for some of these small businesses, JP Morgan did a a study in 2017 which showed that the typical small business has about 27 days of reserves. And for restaurants, small retail, it's even less. So first of all, expediency on the distribution of those loans, and it's a race to see if the economy for those small businesses begins to recover enough so that they can get back with employment and wages by the end of June. So it's the small business sector. If you take less than 500 employees, that's over 95% of the firms in Utah. But it amounts to about half the employment and half of the wages. So you have a few thousand really large firms that contribute about half and aren't eligible for the small business assistance. But there is a group, 1 in 7 employees in Utah, workers in Utah, works for a firm with less than 20 employees.
Well, that's powerful data and powerful information, Jim. Thank you. John and Lloyd, any final comments before we go to Roger and Juliet?
Cameron, just thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with the group. I'm going to drop off in about 5 minutes. I would just say that the next huge question is, how do you re-enter? What are the right precautions? What are the right sanitations? What are the right traffic flows? Those are the issues that I think particularly commercial real estate occupiers, and there's a lot of information coming out on that right now. That's the next big step for commercial real estate users. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lloyd. Jonathan, any final comments?
Just we appreciate the partnerships. I agree with what everybody has said all along. It takes all of us together working on this. So if you have populations you're seeing that are falling through the cracks of unemployment, get on the horn and let me know, because that's exactly who we want to tailor housing assistance for in the short term.
Perfect. And Jonathan and I are both on the housing subgroup, so use us as resources. John Park, I see you're back. I'll let you introduce Roger and Juliet to take us to the finish line.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. I had a little lights flash off and my computer stayed up, but my internet went down, so I lost you for just a minute. Again, thank you, Jim, Jonathan, and Lloyd for your diligent service for helping us out. Now we'll turn the time over to one of our colleagues. Roger Tu is former tax commissioner, and he's going to discuss sales tax information and what does it mean and when do you get your tax policy. So just take it away, Roger. Well, let's introduce Juliet as well. A lot of you were on the phone call a couple of weeks ago when Juliet gave us some statistics. She, of course, is the director of Economic and Public Policy Research at the Gardner Policy Institute. And she gave us some great information and promised to come back and update us on some of that information and add some new information. And we were happy enough to get her back. And so after Roger's done, we'll just turn the time over to Julia. Roger?
Okay, I mean, the hardest part of the thing, did my document come up?
You're there.
Good. I dreaded that more than anything else. My job here is to talk a little more mundane about when you get information about the actual money in terms of cities, counties, and being able to adjust accommodate your budgets. So let me take just a second to talk about the forecasting issue at the state. Jim and others have talked about the process of setting the economic assumptions, and that's really the sort of the hard legwork when they come in to make changes or adjustments on the assumptions of what the economy is going to produce. But the next step is how do you go about coming up with new revenue numbers for the process? And that's what, frankly, Cameron's fielded a lot of calls. I have others saying, when are we going to know, quote, the new numbers? Bear in mind, the state put its budget together clear back in March for next year. And they went through this process, got these assumptions. Clearly, the bottom's fallen out of those assumptions, and they're in the process of preparing to update those. The first process was doing those assumptions. The next is looking at actual collections of money. And for that process, they've got to essentially wait for the process of the collections, which are, in terms of sales tax, are collected monthly. But there is, in effect, a lag in that process that takes place. Now, first of all, I want to indicate here that when the state comes out with its new revenue numbers, they're going to be for the state budget. And they're going to basically talk about how much income tax they're going to have for the Uniform School Fund, for the sales tax, for the general fund, and about 15 other sources of revenue. So, but they're not going to be doing individual forecasts or new money for each of the individual political subdivisions. There's still going to be meaningful information in that, however. For example, the 1% basic sales tax that all cities and unincorporated portions of the counties impose, well, half of that's on population, which means that's going to be directly related to what happens with the overall numbers of the state. So it'll give you some indication in that regard. And there will be other things that will be indicative. Of course, we'll talk about transportation fund in a minute. But there's not going to be anything in there for individual cities per se, but it will give you an indication of what's going to happen with those numbers. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why there is this time lag. Why don't what we know? It's a little bit of like when I travel with my kids and it's a 2-hour trip and everybody's asked me every 20 minutes, when are we going to get there? Well, it takes 2 hours to get the trip. And so the dates on the filings are the money comes in 30 days after the end of the month in which it's due. So in effect, what we have is money that was collected in February, sales tax money collected in February, is filed with the tax commission on those returns from those retailers at the end of March. So you're essentially 30 days, and then the tax commission processes that, and the distribution information essentially goes out around the 3rd week of each month, which would be the information for April was just posted at the first part of this week, talking about what the distribution is. So I wanted to indicate that the first time we'll see information about the actual impact of the COVID-19 impact on sales tax is really going to happen in May. And so that information is essentially the forecast for the state, or we're largely waiting for that collection information. And it comes in on that time frame. So I want to just put up the information here that you can go look when the distribution comes out on the Utah State Tax Commission webpage. What is public information that is there? You don't want to click on the webpage. There's an icon that says Utah taxes. There's another after that. There's an icon that says sales tax. From that, there's an icon that says distribution. And in it, all the distribution for local governments for every single sales tax related rate, there's 16 of them, is listed there. Now, for their monthly distribution. Your cities, the counties are all getting that. You'll get it when it goes public. It goes up, actually, it's EFT transfer, goes to the state treasurer, then back to the individual location. There isn't historical information, but you can process that on your own. So that will come out on that particular date in May, and that's just the first time it's available is then. Now, you can do forecasts without having that data, and I know your cities are going through that process right now. But that's when the particular information, which I think everybody's waiting to see the impact of these economic assumptions, how it translates to the actual sales tax collection. I don't think it's going to be a secret to anybody. They're going to be ugly numbers. And frankly, they may not be the worst. It might be the next month, which will be the whole month of April. But wanted to make sure that you were aware of where that was. I'm sure somebody in your individual cities and counties are, but it might not be the people that are necessarily viewing this. I also wanted to point out one thing is that each sales tax collecting entity or receiving entity also receives information about the filings of individual taxpayers in their jurisdiction. That is a password protected access point. You actually find it on the Tax Commission webpage. It says Tax Express. It will ask for a password, and that will tell you for the same time period the specific filings of individual companies. Now, I want to emphasize one thing here. I was on the Tax Commission for 12 years, and it was pounded into me, and we pounded into our employees, and anybody who has access to this information, there's some very, very serious disclosure dynamics associated with that information. Basically, there are criminal penalties if it's intentionally disclosed. But because it relates to each individual city can have one person, actually can have more than that, who receive that information. And that will tell you, for example, if you're highly dependent on one particular retailer, what's been the impact of that retailer, et cetera. But I just want to emphasize to everybody, that's for analytical purposes within the city. Be really careful with what happens with that information. I always tell the political people, you don't want to know. But in effect, that information is available. So in summarizing the sales tax information, that's when it's going to be available. That's when the state will have the information around that same time frame, and we'll have to come up with new numbers based upon the economic information that was shown earlier. Now I want to say something about, if I can figure out how to scroll down here, on gas tax just a little bit. Motor fuel tax.
Roger, can I ask a question first?
Sure.
Kind of, so to sum up what you just talked about, when we know what taxes are going to look like, for the month of April, we will know the month of April if we get on the, we'll know the month of April if we get on the website in June. We will know March at the 1st of May.
You don't, let's back up. You know the March information today. It is on the website today.
Yeah, so the end.
You will not know April's, which is the big month. That's when we were in the shutdown during the month of April.
And we will know that the 3rd or 4th week in
June.
In May. April we'll know at the end of May.
April you will know at the end of May. And that's just the dynamics. There's that lag that's built into it. So I hope any other questions on that. That's so the first COVID impact is going to be in May. This numbers that we're waiting. The full April, which is the month that's the worst,
the full month,
will be in June. Now on motor fuel. Any other question on that?
No, but Raj, let's jump to Juliet, and then we can come back to you if time permits. John, does that work?
Yeah, perfect. Juliet.
Juliet's got the good stuff.
She's got the good stuff. Go ahead, Juliet.
Oh, thank you. I don't know about that. For those of you that know me, I tend to have a pretty optimistic outlook on life, and so it's really hard to share some of the data points that I'm going to share with you. But let me take you through a couple of new data points. It was a pleasure to speak to you a couple of weeks ago, and I'll just share with you some of the developments in the data since then. Let's see. I will share my screen, and this is Roger. I am completely with you. This is the most nerve-wracking part. It really is. Roger, you're an economist at heart, because this is like every time I give a presentation. All right, good? Thumbs up if you can see it. All right, very good. So let's take a look, and I'll make sure that this gets to Cameron and team to circulate after we wrap up today. But before I jump in, I just want to make sure that you know about a series that the David Eccles School of Business is putting on, providing a lot of great information for businesses in our state. And really, honestly, as local officials, you completely have your pulse on what's going on with businesses. And so I think that you would find these seminars really useful as well. Cameron's participated or has been involved in this. We just want to make sure that you know about it. There will be a seminar tomorrow at 11 a.m. that's focused on nonprofits. And then on Friday, there will be a seminar with really the best and the brightest in our business school on rebuilding business. And also we'll be talking a bit about what the path to recovery looks like and what the timeline for recovery looks like. I do not know if it's been announced yet, but I'm going to go ahead and announce that Mark Zandi, who is the chief economist for Moody's, is actually going to be on that call on Friday. Hopefully Taylor at the business school won't get mad at me for announcing that to this group, but you're an important group of people and you need to know that Mark's going to be on that call. So it's free. Please register. Please join us. And I just think really all we can do right now is consume as much data as possible and try to kind of interpret what that means for our local economies. And I think this will be a really good opportunity. So please join us at that. I feel your pain. As Roger mentions, we're always looking in our rearview mirror. So we've just gotten, you've just getting your tax data for the month of March. The month of March does not have the impacts of COVID-19 fully loaded into it. And then on top of it, we know that a number of filers normally might be eligible to file quarterly, but might be filing monthly just because it's just a cash flow. It's easier operationally. They might be filing monthly. As soon as they get impacted and they're trying to hang on to cash, you might see some of them starting to file quarterly. So it's hard to untangle what's the actual COVID-19 impact, what's some of these kind of noisy structural things that are happening around the edges, or and so I feel your pain, and I think, like I said, the best that we can do is consume relevant data points and make the best predictions from them that we can. So I really like tracking employment data. Employment's like the best proxy for the economy. It comes out timely, and we have an understanding of what's happening within industries. We get a really nice geographical look in those employment data, in those jobs data. Well, those data come out monthly, and so we're dealing with the same thing as you're dealing with taxes. We are very fortunate to have a timely indicator in initial unemployment insurance claims. So people who are walking through workforce services doors are actually going online to file for unemployment insurance. That's a really nice, timely indicator of what's going on. And so I would encourage you, I'll continue to give you updates on these data. Jim talked about them a little bit, but I would encourage you to track the unemployment insurance claims data. They're a nice proxy for all of the other economic activity that's happening within your region. The Utah economy, so looking at these data, actual data that we have in hand, the Utah economy has sharply contracted. At last count, we had about 125,000 new initial claims. That is basically 3 years of job growth just gone. So very, very sharp contraction. Now, to put this into perspective for you, that's about 8% of the Utah workforce. Nationally, those national unemployment insurance initial claims are equivalent to 15% of the US workforce. Incredibly intense impact in Utah, but there are some fundamentals at play that have left us a little less impacted, but still severely impacted. We've likely experienced, at least reading into these claims, and then knowing what we do know about the virus, and that's really when it comes down to it, we just have it all has to do with how this COVID-19 virus plays out. But we believe that we've likely experienced the worst, I'm going to use this word intensity a lot. We've experienced the worst intensity. So we're starting to call the COVID-19 impacts, those impacts that started mid-March. The little red chart on the bottom shows you that basically that first week of April, week 14 in our economist tracking terms, week 14, we hit 33,000 new unemployment insurance claims. That number has started to come down. Now, that doesn't mean that we've hit a bottom or things are greatly improving, but the pace of those claims is decelerating, and the pace needs to decelerate to get to a point where we're improving. To give you kind of some perspective, though, we won't be back into a normal range until we're looking at 1,000 to 2,000 claims a week. This is the same. These are the same story as before. Accommodate and just our intuition tells us accommodations and food service, retail and healthcare are the hardest hit in level. Looking into those claims, and that would translate over very likely into your tax collections. And I'm sorry these numbers are so tiny, but like I said, I'll distribute them so you can look at them like in great detail. But you can just see accommodations and food services cumulatively over 20,000 Utahns who work in that industry are out of a job. And as Jim mentioned earlier, our research shows us that those who are unemployed are greater in number than those who actually file claims, in particular in the state of Utah, our take-up rate is lower. And so this helps you to understand just the intensity of the impact. But in terms of level, accommodations and food services, retail trade, healthcare and social assistance. So healthcare, you would think that there would actually maybe be kind of an uptick in healthcare. However, we think about all of those, I mean, I don't think of them as non-essential, but all of those non-essential type of healthcare services that have not been able to take place over the past couple of weeks. But when we flip over and we take a look at what I'm calling intensity, we're looking at the impacts within each industry. So the number of initial claims by industry as a percent of jobs in that industry, we can see that the intensity definitely varies. So again, number one, accommodations and food services, but now you'll see arts, entertainments, and recreation pop, which makes sense. Other services pops, makes sense. That's your I'm trying to be politically correct, barbers, hairstylists. Those folks are in that category. Administrative and waste services. We always talk about kind of the canary in the coal mine being these temporary job services. Obviously, we don't need a canary in the coal mine to understand what's going on here, but that we've seen a tremendous impact into that industry, which translates over to those folks that are kind of marginally attached to the workforce who are taking advantage of like these temporary jobs right now, severely impacted. So let's flip regionally. Wasatch Front, Washington County account for more than 80% of the contraction. You can see pie chart there. I don't know if I really like pie charts, but at least it gets you to see that some of you that are in our smaller communities in the state, in terms of contributing to the total level of the contraction, there's not as much there. However, I think that it's really important that when we're analyzing economies, we think very locally. So it's one thing to take a look at what's going on at the state level, but it's also really important to dig down into our local economies. And I shared some data with you a couple of weeks ago, and I've updated it here. Again, unemployment insurance claims, which are a great proxy for other things. You can also go in and do a sales tax-based analysis, looking at kind of what your sales tax base looks at, like relative to those industries that are most impacted and most vulnerable. But here you can see that if we look at initial claims as a percent of your county workforce, of people who live in your county, and unfortunately I don't have lower level detail here for you, but this is a pretty good proxy for what's happening at the very, very local level. Grand, Summit, Garfield are very, very impacted. Almost 20% of Grand County's workforce has filed for unemployment insurance. And again, when we look at kind of the historical impacts, we know that there are even more people without a job right now, and that translates over what you can expect to see in those sales tax numbers that are coming forward, some of those numbers coming forward. So again, these are great data to keep an eye on to kind of understand the intensity of the impacts. I actually do have, tune into Mark Zandi on Friday. As Jim Wood mentioned earlier, the Revenue Assumptions Working Group met earlier this week, so the group of Utah economists that project the Utah economic indicators. And there's some optimism in if these health issues can be solved, if we can adhere to all the best public health measures, if we can start to open the economy, that we are in for a pretty good rebound towards the end of the year. And I think that Utah is quite well positioned for that rebound. So very severe numbers, but you can see here that 8% of our workforce, I mentioned this earlier, like 8% of our workforce basically is filed for unemployment insurance, nationally 15%. And then finally, I know Roger was going to talk a little bit about motor fuel tax, and I'd be interested to hear what he has, because this is just like the crystal ball stuff, but you don't have great data on what's happening. And we have great intuition, we have great stories, and we have the past to look to. However, I don't have a lot of experience with global pandemics. So we do, the U.S. Census Bureau does do a monthly retail sales survey. It covers like 12,000 businesses, but it's statistically significant. And we've found when we match it back to actuals after all is said and done, the survey is actually is relatively good for showing us magnitudes and directions. And so we're looking here at the year over change in U.S. retail sales. We won't have Utah sales, right, for quite a while. And you can see that in March, grocery store sales up 30% over the period last year. So if you're a community that has a high intensity of grocery stores, or a large portion of your tax base is grocery stores, you're going to have a different expectation of your position than if, for example, your community's tax base has some amount of concentration in auto dealerships. So auto dealership sales were down almost 25% year over. All retail sales at the U.S. level and the advanced estimates are down 4% in March over the previous period last year. And then finally, gasoline. This is the one that's really hard to get a handle on. So gasoline stores, which is mainly gas, mainly the sale of motor fuel, total sales at the US level for March, down 16%. So again, full impacts of COVID-19 are not loaded into these numbers, but you can see it's a pretty severe contraction in the sales. The one thing though, when I mentioned, it's kind of hard to untangle what's at play. So as I mentioned, the monthly filers actually start filing quarterly, or you have all these little data nuances. We have to remember that the price of motor fuel is significantly down. I think I last checked, it's down over, it's like 25% over last year. And so how that kind of comes into play is something to be thinking about. But you know, the intuition here is that people have contracted on their spending. They've obviously contracted on their travel. And so we do anticipate that you'll be seeing that in your motor fuel sales tax numbers. But maybe the bright side is that if we can get to the point of recovery, which I still am optimistic that we can, right, moving into the end of the year, there's going to be a decent amount of pent-up demand for travel. And honestly, I believe that that pent-up demand for travel will manifest more, and this is just kind of my reading on things, so take it for what it's worth, but I believe that it will manifest more in motor vehicle travel than it will necessarily in air travel, right? You can control, if you're kind of thinking through the health side, you can kind of control some of your risk in your own vehicle. And Utah has incredible assets to visit. We actually saw this past weekend that some folks actually really got out on the roads this past weekend. I'm not sure if that was good or bad. But I think that you can anticipate a relatively strong rebound again if we can get to the point of recovering the virus. So thank you for listening to me. I'll make sure that you get the slides. I will remind you that you can go to gardner.utah.edu for the most up-to-date information on COVID-19. And I would just appreciate you reaching out to me with any specific data requests that you have. And it's always a pleasure to speak to you all. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple questions, Juliet. You mentioned that one of the hardest hit industries was retail sales, yet grocery stores are doing really well. And so that's showing that retail sales sans grocery stores is really dying.
It's really hurting. And that's where it all, you know, the mix of the industry is what's important. So overall, the other stuff is even worse. And then it's buoyed somewhat by grocery. And it also goes to like really thinking about what your community looks like. So if you don't have a lot of grocery, your overall is probably going to be even worse than what some of these numbers might lead, you know, kind of you'd expect on average.
And the three counties that on the map that you had in red, is Grand and Garfield, and probably Summit, but to the lesser extent, but Grand and Garfield really do well with summer travel by vehicle, as you also mentioned. And that should be a big rebound. That's one area that I'm kind of sensing you're saying will rebound as quickly as anything.
That's what we're anticipating, absolutely. That's what we'd be anticipating. Now, again, like it's all with the caveat of, you know, if you have a major resurgence, then all bets are off. However, with the best information we have right now, that's a very reasonable expectation. It is my expectation.
Okay. I know that on our gas tax, part of it is indexed, correct? And part of it is, I don't know if you know the answer to this, Julia. But Roger probably does. Part of it is indexed. Part of it is based on per gallon, but that price how much of it is indexed, isn't that set yearly? So it's set at the first of the year.
We should let Roger answer it. And this is where I think that policymakers, and I know that you all had a lot of influence in how that change was made. It was made in a very smart way. And so people are well positioned, but maybe Roger can talk to how that actually works.
Actually, Cameron knows more than I do.
There you go.
Yeah. Andrew Gruber, I'd say you're actually answering some of these questions on the chat box. So Nick, will you unmute Andrew and Andrew take this question? And then John, let's have this be the last question unless there's anything else that Roger or Juliet have.
Great. And I would love to hear from Andrew.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Okay. So go Andrew and then Roger and then wrap up.
Thanks so much for doing this. Basically, I'll just read what I wrote in the chat box. Gas taxes are calculated as a per gallon rate, not as a percentage of the price. And so the low gas prices now actually aren't going to impact the collections that are coming in. Now, technically, that cents per gallon tax rate is derived originally from a percentage, and that translates into effectively an indexing so that the cents per gallon rate tracks over time and will go up over time. But there's a lag in the way that calculation is done. And there's also a minimum floor on that cents per gallon rate. So what that means is the fact that the price is really low right now is not going to have an impact on the gas tax collections that are done. The thing that has the impact on the gas tax collections is the volume of the sale, which, as Juliet has noted, is really a decline. So that'll have a negative impact on gas tax collections, but it won't be a double whammy from the price being down.
Thank you, Andrew, for clearing that up. Roger?
I have just two quick things to point out. On the gas tax, when the state does their estimate on the transportation funding, that the sole number will apply to local governments as well, because there's a single rate and you're just sharing down at the formula. So it's nothing that happens in your area. So that number will be a number, so to speak. The other thing is, I think Cameron wanted to have us announce that the league has contracted with Econo West, which is Doug McDonald's consulting group, to have us help do some forecasting information for basically we limited to our 63 largest cities, because that's the only thing his database has. But we thought that would give us at least some guidance for those cities who are looking for some help on this. We'll be distributing that information at the end of this week. So that's just to let you know on that.
All right, thank you. And that concludes our town hall meeting. I'd like to thank Juliet again for well, I'm sure we'll probably be begging to have her back in the near future.
Yeah.
And
yes, we will.
and Roger, and of course our special guest star tonight, Mr. Andrew Gruber from Wasatch Front Regional Council. So thank you all, and hang in there, keep healthy.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you at the Lieutenant Governor call tomorrow afternoon.